There are some trains that have entered onto the UK rail network in the past decade that replace either a legendary relic or succeeds its predecessor due to its, say, lack of reliability. Some do succeed replacing any form of relics when it's given time or age to enable to win over those who are skeptical at the beginning. However, on the other hand, there are some trains aren't as fortunate. And there's one train in particular I want to talk about, and that is Great Western Railway's IETs. Now, this wouldn't be a big deal in some ways if it was replacing something that was very unreliable and constantly breaking down all the time. However, in this case, the IET was built as a replacement of the iconic and legendary HST. When the HST began its maiden service on the Great Western Main Line in 1976, it was an instant hit with commuters and rail enthusiasts alike, a marked turning point or a potential game changer for high-speed rail on the British rail system. You gotta remember, this was long before the Channel Tunnel came along. That was until May 1994, HS1 Part 1 in September 2003, over 9 years later, and when HS1 was fully open to St Pancras International in November 2007. From 1976 to 1982, the HST took hold on three key main lines of Great Western Main Line, East Coast Main Line, and the Midland Main Line, as well as also being the game changer not just on those main lines, but also a game changer when it came to cross-country services. Okay, even though it might not be as known as of today. The iconic BR Swallow liveries on these were very recognisable, and at the time, the power engines of the Class 43 locos was its Paxman 12RP200 Valenta engines, which were okay overall. Yes, it may not have been the most reliable, but you have to remember, this was mechanical engineering in the 1970s. Unlike today, we didn't have back then laptops, computers, or thousands of sensors indicating any problems that might occur when compared to modern trains today. So if anyone living at the time near a busy mainline station, whether it was London, York, Bristol, Edinburgh, Nottingham, Leeds, etc., and say it was 5 AM in the morning, if the alarm clock didn't wake you up, then the sound of these engines would, because they would have been so loud. As years went by, even during the period of privatisation of BR in 1994, and despite tragic accidents from Southall, Ladbroke Grove and Newton Nevet between 1997 and 2004, the HST still soldiered on the Great Western Network, racking up the miles. But by 2005, its future was being called into question because of its age. When it was first built, the original HSTs were only planned for a life cycle of 30 years, but with no long-term replacement planned, it was either keep them going until a long-term solution is found or face a major railway crisis. In the end, in November 2005, the Transport Secretary at the time, Alistair Darling, made a key decision, which probably, when you look back on now, was one of the best decisions he probably did at the time when he was in Main Minister for Labour. That was, he decided to keep the HSTs in service for a bit longer. The following month, the first Great Western announced all their HST locos would be re-engined with MTU V16 4000 engines, replacing the original Paxman 12 RP200 Valenta engines. The idea was to improve reliability as well as fuel efficiency, reducing emissions from smoke and exhaust, as well as reducing noise levels. GWR at the time, nowadays LNDR, followed suit, as well as also with other HSTs from cross country. This was only a short-term fix to give the HSTs another 10 more years or beyond, although little was known at the time, which you could say was the first sign that this was mark the beginning of the end of the long-distance HST, as we probably know it as of now. In July 2009, the announcement was made for the electrification of the Great Western Main Line from west of Hazel Harlington to Swansea, Newbury and Bristol Temple Meads by Bath Spa, as well as Bristol Parkway, Oxford from Didcot, and including electrification of both Thames Valley lines, Windsor and Henley-on-Thames. Now, just to point out that back in 2009, I wasn't even train spotting. I was studying music in college at this point. And now looking back on this, when the announcement was made, I think this was where rail enthusiasts should have realised that this would have definitely marked the beginning of the end for the HST on the Great Western Main Line as a long distance train. So when you compare to 3.5 years earlier, when the Class 43 locos were being re-engined, you could say now that was kind of more of the first warning shot that the HSTs were on borrowed time. So just nearly 3 years later, in 2012, it was announced that Hitachi had won the contract to build the next generation of intercity trains, both on Great Western Main Line and East Coast Main Line. This was originally split into 2 phases, with Great Western Main Line being Phase 1. The original order at the time included 21 Class 801s and 36 Class 800s. At the time, the original plan was to use the 21 Class 801s to run full electric services from London Paddington to Swansea or Bristol Temple Meads by Bath Spa or Bristol Parkway. In March 2015, First Great Western announced the requirement of 29 Class 802s to be used in the southwest, which include 22 5-car Class 802-0s and, at the time, rather surprisingly, only 7 9-car 802-1s. But gradually, of course, by mid-2016, this would expand to 14 802-1s, with all 802s being built at Hitachi's manufacturing plant in Pistoia, Italy. It was also around this time, around May 2016, that the original plan for the 21 Class 801s for Great Western Main Line would then now be turned into biomodes, as we know them now as 800-3s. But by this time, the electrification project itself was not going well at all, with constant overruns both from construction, modifications of a lot of road bridges, meant the overspend of the original budget kept getting higher and higher. It was estimated supposed to cost around £800 million, but at this point it was nearly getting close to 2.5 to 3 times that. In November 2016, the government announced the electrification of sections from Oxford to Didcot, Bristol Parkway to Bristol Temple Meads, as well as the Finney Junction to Bristol Temple Meads via Bath Spa, as well as both including Windsor and Henley branches, electrification would be deferred indefinitely. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it meant is that these sections would, at the time, would be put on hold for the time being, however not ruled out entirely in the future in case a chance did come for them to be reinstated at a later date. But for Oxford and Bristol, it was a different story. They were actually being deferred wasn't just because of the cost overruns of electrification, it was actually because the areas themselves required extensive remodeling of the existing track layouts as well as also re-signalling. But then comes July 2017, and this is where the IET's kind of image, well, before it even entered service, took a bit of a black eye, as well as the electrification project itself. This was when Chris Grayling had now been in charge as Transport Secretary for almost a year, then decided himself to think this was a good idea. He then, for some reason, ironically enough a few days before the summer recess in Parliament, to scale back the electrification on the Great Western itself from Swansea back to Cardiff Central. It turned out that according to a National Audit Office report later emerged, in March 2018, found out that this decision was made several months earlier. The consequence of this was huge. It also led at the time to the cancellation of the Midland Main Line electrification north of Kettering, as well as some electrification of some lines in the north. This at the time caused extensive outrage, and to be honest, at the time, even when I heard the news, I can't blame MPs, enthusiasts, or unions for being absolutely infuriated with the decision, and the timing of it was highly questionable. So as a result, 801s that originally should have been for Great Western will now be used for different unit types for those on ANER. So what was the reason behind this then? Okay, by 2017, the Great Western Electrification project was not only 3.5 times the original budget, costing £2.4 billion. Now, here's what I would have done. Personally, in this situation, if it was me in this case, I wouldn't stop. I would probably still, realistically, wouldn't stop with just the project half done. I would still time, because if you look at the rail system in Wales, for example, they need a complete overhaul and modernisation to make it fit for the 21st century, which is not just politicians crying out, not just enthusiasts have been crying out, but also people in Wales themselves have been crying out for decades. Secondly, if the electrification to Swansea Bristol was going to take longer, then it's better to get it done whilst, yes, costly short term, but in the long term of things, it would save you the constant problems that we've got now. But if you thought that was bad, well, a few months later, things got worse for the IET. So when the first IET service was launched in October 2017, the reputation had already had a black eye even before it was launched, and then on the opening day, it got even worse. So on its integration service, the air conditioning system decided to do its own thing. Not only it was not working, it had decided to wet itself. And ironically enough, yep, Chris Graham himself was actually on that train at the time. Not only this was a disastrous launch for the trains, and as a result had to be put out of service for several days, this was an utter embarrassment for both Great Western Railway, which by the way we branded 2 years earlier from First Great Western, Hitachi, who built the trains, and of course DFT as well. The flaws on the train were, at first glance, were very simple from when you look at them now. The biggest thing in them all is, if I look at them, is the coupling system for starters. The coupling system on this train is very vulnerable and very easy for them not to work at all. Because it's very easy, if you leave the nose open, can be easy to get contaminated with dirt or dust. The sensors themselves, which are computerized by the way, means if they got contaminated, then they just won't lock on. I remember one time in January 2020 seeing this first time at Bristol Temple Meets, when one rear set of an IET tried to couple on with another 5-car set, and for some reason just wouldn't lock on. Likely reason wasn't because of a faulty computer, it was because the sensors were not cleaned up or decontaminated, is probably the best way of putting it. So for example, on the submarines, if a torpedo gets loaded into a launch tube, then you have to make an electrical connection to complete your systems checks. But to do this, you have to make sure it's cleared of dust, which can take several attempts to do. So in this case, when you compare the two, it's very similar. But that wasn't the only other problem. The next issue is the doors themselves. The doors, for me, were way lighter, and of course the aluminium being less bulky, although more in that situation to come later. But the biggest problem that was to come out was the seat, and oh dearie me, it was complained the minute they first got into service. Now, I didn't take my first ride on one of these till May 2018, coming back from filming in the Thames Valley, and I have to say, it just didn't really impress me at all. I didn't mind the green layout interior, But the seating I could see where some people, I kept hearing it from the seats are uncomfortable, the ironing boards, I kept hearing it all the time. And to be honest, I couldn't blame anybody at the time. So, the thing is, the problem we've got is in the modern era of rail travel, or where modern trains are replacing older trains, is unfortunately capacity nowadays takes precedence or rides roughshod over comfort. And to be honest, in some ways, it's not hardly surprising. Now at this point, Hitachi themselves should have realised they actually have a much bigger battle on their hands to persuade passengers as well as rail enthusiasts that their Intercity Express trains were fit for purpose. But ever since the first day it was launched, over 4 years on, it still remains divisive even now. But more on that later, because there's other issues still to come. So nearly a year after its launch, in August 2018, the Class 802s began to run on GWR. Also around this time, other Intercity Express trains were also being ordered by Transpennine Express with 802-2 Novas, and also Hull trains ordering 802-3s, now nicknamed Paragons. So the Class 802s, yes, they look the same, nothing usual outside, right? Except a few minute things. The biggest difference was the diesel engines. On the Class 800, the diesel engine power being 750 horsepower, which is okay for most times except for routes with steep inclines. See, where the Class 802s have an extra 190 horsepower on top with 940 horsepower, which can deal with steep inclines more easily and also would save a lot more fuel. Requiring this also needed much bigger fuel tanks, especially on the steep hills from where I am based in the southwest, especially between Newton Abbot and Plymouth, for example. But by March 2019, as more and more HSTs slowly began to disappear from GWR as IETs were slowly taking over, many enthusiasts, both old and young, probably knew at this time the ending of the HST on Great Western was coming. And inevitably, on Wednesday, March 20th, 2019, it was announced that the HST would bow out of London Paddington for the final time on Saturday, May 18th, 2019. For me at the time, having just moved to Devon from Essex a month earlier, this was a case of using the time to try out Reading Station with old and new, and get as many videos as possible, and if lucky, travel them one last time on the HST before they went. On April 27, 2019, after being in London at Acton Depot Open Weekend, as well as filming in Stratford, I took one final journey on the HST on GWR. I have to say though, it was really good. Although I didn't know at the time what to think, because I didn't really think much about it. It was pretty much a long day at the time, so I go and just just make use of it while you could. So fast forward 3 weeks later, May 18, 2019, London Paddington. Many would say farewell to these iconic trains that were the game changer of Great Western Main Line, and so to be no more. So I decided, instead of just turning up to see the HSTs go, I decided to use the opportunity to do two things in one go. A normal spotting video featuring both the last HSTs, and of course finishing up with the IETs completing the final takeover. Also around this time, as before that, whilst it was King's Cross earlier that day, the Zoomers testing was still ongoing at this point, although they were having their problems of their own due to magnetic electronic disturbance. Although that's for another story. So since May 18, 2019, the HST's role on GWR is still around in some ways. Nowadays, cars of HSTs, originally they were going to retain only about 11, but due to recent demand in the last few years, they've expanded that to about 14 sets, and that's pretty much a good thing for me as well. By December 2019, when I went back to Reading for my Christmas special at the time, in some ways it did feel really strange not having the HSTs there, However, it was around this time I began to understand in some ways why some enthusiasts prefer HSTs over IETs. It wasn't due to so many issues which they were dubbed due to stubborn issues such as cheap plastic, uncomfortable seats. However, the storm that occurred that month exposed the IETs to a new problem, and no prize for guessing, it was Dawlish. So when the trains were built, they were dubbed to be suitable to take on the waves of Dawlish. Well, TFT and Hitachi must have thought that in their minds, since the HSTs can do then why can't IETs? Well, that's where the complacency really became apparent. I remember one occasion that on a Thursday, I was heading up to London for my last weekend breakaway, and my train was over 20 minutes late at Exeter St David's. Yes, the weather was very bad, but the reason the train was being late wasn't because of an on-board system issue, no, it because it got stopped, ironically, passing Dawlish. The answer was that one of the diesel engines got hit by a wave and caused the train to stall. And that's not the first time it's happened. In fact, it's happened a few times since then. Even before recording this video, even several weeks ago, there was one situation where two IETs broke down, ironically, in the same place because of the same reason. Now, the IETs, despite its flaws and even the pandemic that would strike in March 2020, still solid on racking up the miles, although passenger numbers when non-central travel was allowed to resume again that summer, was still down. But if you thought some of those were the worst issues, that was nothing compared to what was to come last year. On April 30th, 2021, news broke out that cracks had been found on some IET sets, which at first seemed like was to be a minor issue. But the following week, on Saturday, May 8th, was when this minor issue escalated into a major rail crisis. Just after 4 AM at Lara in Plymouth, the alarm was raised when more cracks were discovered on more IET sets, and Hitachi as a result made an unprecedented decision to withdraw all Intercity Express trains from service for urgent inspection. So that includes all IETs on GWR, Azumas on LNER, the 802 Novas on Transpacific Express, and 802 Paragons on Hull trains. However, by May 13th, 5 days later, it was agreed that inspections were to increase on both the lifting pads as well as yaw dampers to enable trains to get returned to service as soon as possible. However, on Great Western's case, as well as LNER, it would take another 2 weeks on top just to get at least most of the trains back up and running. So, in the preliminary report that was released back in September 2021, the fact is two things came out of it. Firstly, the primary problem was the cracks were found to be round where the jacking plates were part of the train underneath the chassis that's used for the carriage to be lifted for maintenance, and were fears that if it failed, although the chassis would stay intact, but the cracked piece of the plate could shear off at full speed. The DFT and Rail Accident Investigation Branch began investigating this, and at the time of this recording, the final report into this debacle still hasn't been published yet. Although one new flaw that was uncovered was actually more to do with the train's aluminium skin. Now, in Britain, most modern day trains are built using the aluminium type 6000, which is not only more durable, but also more resistant to metal fatigue. But for some reason, Hitachi decided to use a Type 7000 aluminium. Yes, it hardens to make the aluminium skin more stronger, but the major flaw comes to when it comes into contact with anything, and it is more prone to metal fatigue. So the thing is that one of the things that was discovered was that the saltwater conditions like Dawlish or other changing type of conditions over time would actually weaken the aluminium skin. So that means it turns out as a result, that the trains themselves is a bit like something they have of aluminium panels on an aircraft. So the panel itself unfortunately comes into contact, has to be fixed with a dry epoxy. But if the epoxy is contaminated with dirt or humid type conditions, the aluminium bonding itself that fits to a plane can fail. So it turns out in this case, the trains themselves get the punishment of the good most. It has to be heat treated correctly. But the thing is though, at the moment, questions still remain unanswered at the moment whether Hitachi themselves did follow the correct procedure. So for now, temporary solutions that all IETs will be checked by well-specialist engineers this thoroughly, and if any train is found to have cracks, then it must be taken out of service until repairs are made, which according to the reports, that one train on average take a repair time for that is around 2 to 3 days. A long-term solution going forward, while it still hasn't been found, but it's likely one has to be found by the end of 2022. Because of some of the flaws and the issues that have occurred, combined with Hitachi's struggles to convince some about the IETs, I would say that this in some ways can define train building going forward in the future, and what it could mean for manufacturers, not just Hitachi, but also likes of Stadier, CAV, Siemens and Alstom, when it comes to building future trains for the UK rail system, will likely to be subjected to more scrutiny by the public that use them. Even today, whilst the IETs have proved some worth in journey times, however, I understand why Hitachi and GWR still face a struggle to convince many of its critics and its comparison to the legacy of the HST era. So that's my take on this. So what's your take on it? Do you think Hitachi can convince its critics going forward with its intercity trains long term? Or if so, what improvements can be made to the trains that are building going forward, including new ones still to come for EMR with 810 Auroras, as well as eventually those to come on the Swansea West Coast, replacing the Voyagers with class 805s and 807s. So whatever happens, one thing is certain. It's a debate that will still go on and on, whether you favour an HST or IET. So leave your thoughts in the comments below. Leave a like, share, or if you're new to the channel, you can subscribe. And until next time, see you in the next video. Bye guys.